Hi, I'm David Shipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Two reporters. Start now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, Danny. How are you doing?
Great, thanks. And here's our mission today. We're going to hear the astonishing details of how courts across America are sending low-income people to debtors' prison.
Debtors' prisons. Sounds like something out of Dickens. Actually, if there aren't enough things to make your blood boil these days, this one will add to all of those. And I'll bet you most of the people listening really know nothing about this.
I sure did not.
It turns out that courts across the country routinely send people to jail because they can't afford to pay all kinds of fines and fees that the local government charges. Some of them very small, but huge for those folks because they're low income, many of them. And yet the Supreme Court has ruled that this is unconstitutional for various reasons.
And we're not talking about major crimes here. People are going to jail because they couldn't afford to pay fines and fees after they got charged with traffic tickets, for example. Or they're going to jail because they fell behind paying garbage collection fees. And who can explain all this better than a judge? Well, in this case, a former judge. Lisa Foster. First of all, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And everything Dave and I have been saying sounds totally crazy.
It is crazy. It's also unconstitutional, as you indicated. The number of lawyers I talk to who have no clue that this happens in courthouses every day is, in the thousands. I mean, it's not something people know much about.
So Lisa Foster was a Superior Court judge in San Diego for 10 years. That's equivalent to a district judge. And then she ran an important branch of the U.S. Justice Department called the Office for Access to Justice, which was designed to help low-income people get treated fairly in the judicial system. Have Trump and Musk shut it down? Probably. I don't know. Maybe you know, Lisa.
Not yet.
Not yet. On oversight, apparently.
Don't say that.
And then Lisa co-founded the national nonpartisan organization called the Fines and Fees Justice Center.
And Lisa, before we go on, we should stress that you and other people who work on this issue cannot answer a simple question, which is, how many people actually go to debtors' prison every year because they can't pay fines or fees?
We don't know.
And we know you've tried to find out. You've asked states across the country for this information, right? And most states haven't told you.
We could get no reliable data on jail. So in a data-driven world, it is astonishing and appalling how little data there is in our justice system.
A lawyer I talked to who works at another nonprofit group said, well, my estimate is that thousands go to jail each year for not paying fines and fees. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds right. I can't tell you how many thousands, but yeah.
So give us a picture, would you, of the problem? And then what did you see that so outraged you that you decided that you had to do something about this?
So let me start by saying the problem with fines and fees is that state and local governments are bankrupting families to bankroll themselves. They are using the justice system as a way of raising revenue. They're imposing taxes in the justice system, and they're imposing them on the people who can least afford to pay them.
But what do you mean? Explain taxes.
Sure. So let me just digress with a little vocabulary. So as most people know, a fine is a monetary sanction for violating the law. If you've ever gotten a speeding ticket, you know there's a fine that's imposed by state or local government. That's the penalty for violating the law. And fines have a very long history. They date back to 1755 BCE at least, when they first appeared in writing.
Wow.
In Hammurabi's code. In those days, they were paid to the victim of a crime. By the Middle Ages, they start being paid to the state. And they're ubiquitous in our country and many other countries.
And I'm all for fines in many cases. For example, if people go through red lights, I want a big fine. So I'm good with that.
Well, maybe and maybe not. Let me challenge you a little bit on that. We think that the fine is both a punishment, and I suspect you think it also might deter people from doing it again.
Hopefully.
The problem is that when you fine someone in an amount that they can't afford to pay, you don't achieve either of those goals. If I run a red light and the fine is $200, I'm going to pay it. I may have some choice words to say about it, but I'll go on with my life. It may keep me from doing it again, maybe, maybe not. But $200 to a minimum wage worker is more than that person can pay. And what we've done all over the country is create a penalty structure for non-payment that is so draconian that it ends up with people going to jail.
In other words, I got a $200 ticket, I don't pay it, I got a $400,
Well, lots of things happen when you can't afford to pay that ticket. But let me digress for 1 second, because it's not just a fine that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's also fees, right?
Exactly. In addition to that fine, in many places around the country, we also impose fees. And those fees really are taxes, because they're not meant to be part of the punishment. They are meant to raise revenue. They go either to a specific fund for something, or they go into the general fund. And they're not the punishment, they're just a way of raising taxes.
This is the part that really blew my mind because, okay, fines are one thing, but you've started to make me think differently about fines, frankly. But the fees, let me just read a few examples of the kind of fees people pay if they're hauled into court because they didn't pay their speeding ticket or their garbage collection or whatever. Arizona, when this report was written, charged a 10% surcharge on all civil and criminal fines to fund political campaigns in the state. Alabama uses these fees to fund what's called the American Village. It's kind of like Williamsburg, Virginia, with ye old revolutionary buildings and educational activities. Florida uses fees to fund a brain and spinal injury program, great sounding program, but from traffic tickets.
And let me just add to that, Danny, if I can. It's not just that one fee. There are multiple fees that are imposed at conviction in many states. Let me give you an example from my home state, California. A $35 speeding fine carries with it an additional $200 in fees.
Good grief.
What?
So the ticket isn't $35. The ticket is $235.
Well, does that kick in if you don't pay the ticket?
No.
Oh, it's anyway, even if you pay it.
That is anyway.
Oh, my heavens.
And to get to that number, there are at least a dozen different fees. One of them, for example, is a, quote, night court fee. Now, one would think that they charge that fee because you went to court at night and maybe it cost state a little more money to have night court. But you would be wrong, because there is no night court in California. But in fact, that fee is assessed on every single ticket, whether you go to night court or not.
Really?
You're paying for emergency air medical transportation.
So the money goes into that fund, in other words, to provide for that.
Correct. How is that related to your speeding ticket? This was a recent example in Idaho. There was a woman who, she was arrested for possessing drug paraphernalia. She had a pipe or something like that in her car.
But no drugs, just the equipment.
No drugs, just the paraphernalia. She gets arrested, she goes to court. The judge actually realizes that she doesn't have very much money. At the time, she was working part-time at a Burger King at about $12 an hour, but only part-time. And so the judge put her on a payment plan. She could pay about $350 that he imposed in fines and fees at $25 a month. Now, that sounds reasonable, but here's what happens when you're working part-time at a Burger King at $12 an hour. Life happens. Your landlord raises your rent, or your car breaks down, or your kid gets sick, or, as happened to this woman, she lost her job. Burger King just said, we don't need you anymore, thank you very much. And so she missed a couple of those $25 monthly payments. a warrant went out for her arrest. And she is arrested, spends a week in jail before she's seen by a judge who imposes more fines and fees and puts her on the same $25 a month payment plan. An enterprising public defender who was representing her sued and said, you can't issue a warrant and put someone in jail because they can't afford to pay their fines and fees. The United States Supreme Court has told us that unequivocally, and they said that back in 1983 in a case called Bearden versus Georgia. They said the only way you can put someone in jail for their failure to pay fines and fees is if they do it willfully. So if I have the money and I am angry at the court or I want to thumb my nose at the system, then you can put me in jail because I don't pay the fines and fees. But if I don't have the money, you can't do that. The justice system doesn't punish people because they're poor. The Supreme Court, as I said, was unequivocal, and that was a long time ago. But in almost every state, warrants are issued for non-payment of fines and fees.
But wait, what happened to the woman in Idaho?
She got out, and the Idaho Supreme Court said the public defender was right, and you can't issue warrants anymore.
Lisa, let's go back in history a bit, if we could. When did it hit you, this terrible idea that people were being locked up just because they couldn't pay fines and fees?
So, as you said at the outset, I left the bench to go work for the United States Department of Justice, and while I was there, in 2014, in a small town outside St. Louis called Ferguson, Missouri.
Oh, yeah.
Famous Ferguson, Missouri. Yeah.
A young black man named Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer. And as people may remember, the community exploded.
You need to disperse immediately or you will be subject to arrest.
And let me just interject to say we have a news clip here. Let's listen for a moment.
What you're looking at is the aftermath of the grand jury deciding not to indict Officer Wilson.
That's one police cruiser that is fully engulfed right now.
And eventually the Justice Department launched an investigation into the Ferguson Police Department to understand both the source of the community's anger and what had happened more directly with Michael Brown. And I was stunned because the report was not just about the Ferguson Police Department. It was also about the city of Ferguson and Ferguson's municipal court. Ferguson was in an incestuous relationship with the police department and the city itself. The city was budgeting to collect about 30% of the city's revenue from fines and fees imposed by the municipal court. The mayor would routinely email the police chief and say things like, and this is a direct quote, "up the revenue pipeline." And so the police would stop people, and they stopped people largely in Ferguson's black community, and they would have contests to see how many tickets you could write in a single stop. They would patrol and look for municipal code violations, like people who left their garbage cans out on the sidewalk for more than 24 hours, or had a car parked maybe on their lawn, or had in the town of Jennings nearby mismatched curtains.
Mismatched curtains? You get fined?
Mismatched curtains, yeah.
You would get fined.
And no drapes on a basement window.
Correct.
And more than 3 people at a barbecue, right?
Correct. Cracks in your driveway.
This is incredible because, of course, I know that the police in Ferguson and many other communities picked on African Americans and other minorities more than whites. But I never realized that it was, to a large extent, to raise money through fees for the city government.
And then what would happen is when you went to Ferguson's municipal court, the court would impose fines and fees. And if you could not afford to pay, the court was putting people in jail. And they would leave you in jail until you could come up with all of the money, or they'd start bargaining with you. And they would say, okay, well, call your grandma, call your auntie, call your sister, call your spouse, and see if you can get us $250. As if your grandma, your aunt, or your spouse actually owed any money. They didn't. They didn't do anything wrong. But they wanted the money, and then they would let you out of jail if you could cough up some of that money.
Crazy. So some people might say that Ferguson was many years ago. Give us some recent examples about how a person's inability to pay fines and fees ended putting them in jail.
Just recently in Lexington, Mississippi, was the subject of another Department of Justice investigation. And it's precisely the same story as Ferguson, a city using its police department and its municipal court to raise revenue. And they are literally putting people in jail for offenses as minor as parking in a disabled space and keeping you there until you pay everything that you owe.
Can I just insert a statistic? Last year, a justice of the peace in Texas, in the county around Houston, suddenly sort of stumbled across the fact that 12,500 arrest warrants had gone out for non-payment of fines and fees. He was so shocked, he issued an order to recall all of those warrants, which caused a lot of controversy because a lot of people in Texas said, you're soft on crime. But what he also found that in a recent period, over 100 people who owed money in his court for the lowest kinds of misdemeanors were in jail or had served in jail.
So let me just say, to add, to make this even worse, warrants come with a fee.
Oh, come on.
So you have to pay a fee because you're the target of a warrant.
Exactly. Texas does this all the time. Texas has close to 1,000 municipal courts. And I don't want to suggest this is only a problem in small towns, as you just indicated, Danny. This happens in cities large and small, and it happens in all levels of courts. In New Mexico, the warrant fee is $100. $100. And so judges will sometimes ask you, can you pay everything that you owe today? So the total fines and fees is $500. Can you pay that today? And you say, no, I don't have $500 in my wallet, and I don't have a credit card, and I don't have a check. So the judge will say, well, how much can you pay today? And you might say, well, I have $50 in my pocket, or 20 or whatever it is. And then the judge will say, okay, come back in 2 weeks and bring me another $50.
It's a negotiation.
It's a negotiation, but it's an order to come back to court. And in many places, they do this on a regular basis until you pay it off. They might say, okay, come back every month with $50. But at $500, that's 10 months, that's 10 court appearances. Now, even if you're not a low-income person, you have work, you may have a childcare problem, you may get sick. Try calling a court and changing your court date. It is not easy. Today, they rarely answer the phone. So you might miss, in the course of those 10 months, a court appearance. And then a warrant goes out because you didn't appear in court and you didn't pay anything that month. And you get picked up. And let me just say one other thing that happens in a way people get in jail. In several states, you can, quote, sit out your fines and fees. It's called stay to pay or pay to stay. The judge says to you, well, you can't afford to pay, so you'll go to jail, and we'll credit you $50 a day or $100 a day or whatever they have determined is the right amount. And sometimes that's by statute, and sometimes that's just the judge's decision. So you will go to jail, and let's say you owe $500 and they're crediting you $100 a day. You'll stay in jail for 5 days, and at the end of that, you won't owe them anything.
In fact, let me just give you an example from a really excellent article in the New York Times Magazine not too long ago. In Mississippi, there was a guy named Glenn Chastain who owed $1,200 for expired vehicle tags. He couldn't pay the fines and fees. They put him for 48 days in the county jail. And he says he was in a unit that had rapists and murderers, and he was beaten to a pulp by some of the inmates. That's what happened because he couldn't pay for his vehicle registration.
We see it. A recent example comes out of, again, a small town this time in Alabama called Brookside. It has only about 1,200 people. It's about 10 miles north of Birmingham. And in 2018, they had a single police officer. Not surprising, 1,200 people, no murders, no rapes, one robbery, one cop. But around 2018, they hired a new police chief, and he and the city decided that the way to raise more money for his police department, as well as the city's coffers, was to be aggressive about traffic.
It's just a 1.5-mile stretch of Interstate 22, but many alleging Brookside turned this into a ticket trap, generating hundreds of thousands of dollars.
I asked him why he was towing my car. He said because I was illegal to be on the highway.
Holly Witt says she was driving to Florida.
And by 2021, only 3 years later, they had 14 police officers in the town of Brookside.
They could afford it, huh?
The police department's budget jumped from $37,000 in 2017 up to close to $500,000 by 2020. It's a force equipped with blacked-out vehicles and military-style gear.
And arrests rose 1,000%. First, they would cite you for minor violations. There was a small bit of an interstate that ran through their town, and they would cite people for driving in the left lane, 2 lanes in each direction. The problem is there's no law in Alabama that prohibits you from driving in the left lane. So they would stop people for things that weren't even crimes. And then they would tow your car. And they had a deal with a tow company, an exclusive deal, and that company would tow your car. There was, again, in 2 years, a 1,500% increase in the number of vehicles that they towed. They would charge you fees to get your car back, and if you couldn't pay them, there were, of course, storage fees that grew every day, and people ultimately couldn't afford to get their cars back, and they would sell your car. And again, if you were unable to pay, they would put you in jail.
Now, you're using the past tense, but is it still going on?
Not today in Brookside, as far as we know, and that's because there have been multiple lawsuits filed in Brookside. The Justice Department chimed in on one of them, saying that what was going on was unconstitutional.
And of course, the Justice Department took action in that case under President Biden, not Trump.
And they fired the police chief, elected a new mayor, hired a new municipal court judge, and so it's better now.
But is it going on elsewhere still?
Sure.
Just to remind everybody, we're talking with Lisa Foster. She's a former judge and co-founder of Fines and Fees Justice Center. Lisa, you said earlier that the practice of fining people goes back thousands of years. But when did America's courts start assaulting people with all these fees?
They are a relatively recent phenomenon. We really didn't see very many fees until we get to the 1980s. And then we have the beginning of an explosion of fees throughout the country. And it really came from the federal government, ironically, and that was because in 1982, the federal government ended a long existing program called the Law Enforcement Administration Act. And at the time, it provided about $2.7 billion for state and local governments to use for their courts and law enforcement. And the feds, Congress and President Reagan, just eliminated the program cold turkey, a little bit like what we're seeing now. And as a result, state legislators started looking around. Where are we going to get the money to fund the programs that were being funded by federal dollars? And they start imposing these fees in the system. In the meantime, we had mass incarceration.
Well, the drug war.
The drug war. We had people going to prison in unprecedented numbers. That costs money, not just for more jails and prisons, but all the ancillary costs of running a system like judges, like courthouses, like probation officers and court staff. Where's the money going to come from? Well, by that point, sort of late 1980s, we have a no new taxes movement sweeping the country. And nobody's going to raise taxes to do that. So again, we start imposing fees. That continues and gets even worse by the time we get to the 2008 recession, when as it sweeps through the public sector, again, legislators, city councils think the justice system is a piggy bank and raise either the number of fees that are imposed or the amount of those fees in every state except 3.
So the fees are a revenue-raising measure, and that's why you call them a tax.
Correct.
It's a hidden tax.
Exactly. And today, they account for more than half of the monetary sanctions imposed. So they're bigger than the fines almost everywhere.
And we should stress again that communities are imposing these fees on people who get accused of something, even if it's incredibly minor, and even if it usually has nothing to do with the reason they're charging the fees. I mean, it's just...
Well, it's just unconstitutional, among other things. Lisa, I love the Constitution. I keep a copy here on my desk. Could you please explain what was the basis for the Supreme Court ruling that it violates the Constitution when you jail people because they can't afford to pay fines or fees?
The case, Bearden, the case where the Supreme Court said you can't jail someone for unpaid fines and fees, the court's decision in Bearden was really a combination of both the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause and due process, which is found in both the 5th and 14th Amendment. And really the crux of the court's opinion is it is a violation of equal protection. Equal protection says we treat people the same in similar circumstances or the same circumstances. The court recognized putting somebody in jail is the single greatest power the state has, government has, is to take away your liberty. That's a big deal. And you don't do that simply because someone is poor. So if you take 2 people, Mr. Bearden and you take Mr. Jones, they both commit the same offense. And they're both, the same amount of fines and fees are imposed on both of them. There's an added punishment for Mr. Bearden. He's now going to go to jail. And that's not for whatever it was he did in the first place. That added punishment is only because Mr. Bearden is poor. And what the court said was that is just not what our Constitution involves. And again, they grounded it in equal protection and due process.
And under the 8th Amendment, too, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, but also bars, quote, excessive fines.
But it's really that we can't have a justice system where you're treated differently just because you have no money.
I want to take a step back, though, because I think probably everybody listening to this has one huge question, in addition to the outrage they're likely feeling like I am. Since the Supreme Court has ruled several times that all of this is unconstitutional, how is it that in court after court, in state after state, in hundreds, thousands of courts, the judges are sending people to jail because they're not paying their fines and fees?
There are lots of explanations for that, but one is that in most municipal courts in the United States, the judge doesn't necessarily have to be a lawyer, and so may not know that the Constitution prohibits the judge from doing that.
Even you, Danny, could be a judge.
Really?
But seriously, and I could be tapped to be a judge in one of these courts?
You can. The judges in municipal courts are either appointed by the city council or the mayor. In Ohio, they can actually be the mayor.
But just to make it, you don't have to be a lawyer to know what the Supreme Court has ruled. I'm not a lawyer, and I know a lot about what the Supreme Court has ruled.
Well, that may be, and they should know. It's not an excuse, but they may not know. And in many of those courts, there are no lawyers at all. So we all think that if you're accused of anything, you have the right to a lawyer, right? And certainly something that's criminal. And in many places, traffic tickets are criminal. But that's not true. you're only entitled to a lawyer in our system if one of the consequences is going to jail. Now, most courts don't think of that. Oh, well, down the line, you might go to jail if you can't afford to pay the fines and fees. And there's no public defender around. And often in places, there's no prosecutor who's a lawyer around either. In many places, we allow police officers to act as the prosecutor. So there are many places where there are no lawyers. That's one explanation. The other is, frankly, people forgot.
You mean people forgot the rulings, the Supreme Court rulings?
The rulings.
This is crazy.
And there was so much pressure on courts to raise revenue. And again, this didn't start to happen until late 1980s into the 90s.
Let me ask you something. I mean, you were a judge. Did you impose these fees?
I did.
Did you have a choice? Could you have avoided them?
I'll tell you a story.
This is like true confession.
It is. So the first time I had to sentence someone, my clerk comes into my chambers with a Post-it note. And on it, she has written down fees. And there's a dollar amount. And then it says public defender fee. And there's another dollar amount. And she said, you have to impose the public defender fee separately. They probably taught you that.
Yeah.
But just in case, here's the amount. And I looked at her and I said, public defender fee? I watch TV. I know you have a right to a free lawyer if you can't afford one. What's this fee? And she kind of shrugged her shoulders and said, you're the judge. So I went next door to one of my colleagues and I said, I went to law school. I know that there's a constitutional right to a free lawyer if you can't afford it. What is this fee? And he said, oh, Lisa, the legislature requires us to impose it. But don't worry, no one ever pays it.
Oh, gosh.
But what did I do? The legislature told me I had to impose this fee. What I didn't know was all of the things California did to that defendant when the person didn't pay that fee, as well as the hundreds of other dollars in fees I was forced to impose. Because at that point, California first imposed a $300 late charge if you didn't pay everything you owed within 30 days. So the amount you owed goes up dramatically. They would suspend your driver's license.
Oh, my.
Then you can't get a job.
Right. A state like California, how are you getting to work if you don't have a car?
Obviously.
How do you get your kids to school? How do you get yourself or a loved one to a doctor's appointment if you don't have a car? So what happens? People drive anyway, even though their license is suspended. And then if you get stopped for driving on a suspended license, guess what happens? More fines and fees get imposed that you can't afford to pay. We then do things like, in California in those days, we would intercept your tax refund. We would levy your bank account. We would garnish your wages. And all those things have a dramatic impact on your credit report. So you already probably, if you are indigent because you couldn't afford a lawyer, don't have great credit, but now you have even worse credit, and that means you're going to have a hard time renting an apartment or a place to live.
Or getting a car loan for an automobile you need to get to work, and it is a spiral that drags people down.
Exactly.
So you can start with a speeding ticket and go into that spiral.
That is exactly right.
It sounds as if a lot of judges don't realize that you can't pay. I mean, maybe it's just a class distinction.
There is. And I actually, one of the things when I am spending all of my time now working with courts and judges, and one of the things I try to do is talk about how hard it is to live when you don't have money. We did a survey of people. It was a statistically significant survey of people in the United States to determine first how many people actually have owed what we call court debt in the last 10 years, and then what were the consequences. And of the people who owed money, 99% of the respondents who had minor children in the house told us that they had to sacrifice what we considered an essential need, so food, shelter, childcare, transportation, in order to pay their court debt. And the average person was making $49,000 a year. We're not talking about people with literally no money. We're talking about working people who are trying to make ends meet.
Yeah, well, I wrote a book called The Working Poor, and I spent 5 years with families exactly like the ones you're talking about, who just could not make ends meet, especially if there's an additional expense like a court fine or fees.
Right. I mean, the Federal Reserve surveys Americans every year, and consistently they find that about 40% of Americans do not have access to $400 if there's an emergency. $400.
So when you stop me for speeding, or if you come to my door and knock because I haven't paid my garbage collection fee, and then I get more fees and fines and I can't pay those, the spiral that we talked about earlier, the spiral, it just doesn't drag me down, it drags down my whole family.
This impacts families, it impacts communities. If you have to give up food or clothing or shelter or health care in order to pay your fines and fees, who's suffering? It's not just you, it's also your kids. And here's what also happens. When you get picked up on a warrant and you go to jail, you often lose your job. Most employers are not terribly sympathetic. If you miss work because on your way to work you got stopped by a police officer who then takes you to jail because there's a warrant out for unpaid fines and fees.
And most of these folks are in hourly wage jobs, so that's right. I mean, they are dispensable, or the employers see them as such. So.
And the other thing that happens if you're taken to jail for more than a few hours, you're at risk of losing your children. We know of people who have been stopped with their kids in the car, and those kids are taken to protective services because there's nobody to take care of them. Who's coming? Unless there's someone else in the car who's willing to take those children, or you can call grandma in time to get her there. You're talking about people losing their children over this, and trauma being inflicted on kids.
These are terrible chain reactions that people suffer, one thing after another, leading to another and another. Yeah, all of these issues, when you mention children and budgets, what I found was that in all of the various expenses people have to face, the one for food is the most malleable. I mean, you have to pay the rent, you have to pay the electric bill, you have to make the car payments, but you can squeeze the food budget, but that sacrifices good nutrition for kids. And at critical periods of brain development, it means cognitive impairment, actually. There's been a lot of research on that. So these fees and fines that are levied have enormous impact that go far beyond, what the obvious is, far beyond the surface.
That's exactly right. And it is explaining that, not just to judges, but also to the legislators who have imposed these fees in particular over decades, or city council members or county boards of supervisors, to elected officials who are making these policies, who are imposing these fees. When we sit down and talk to them about the impacts throughout their communities, when we bring those families in to testify at a hearing, at a legislative hearing on a bill, that's what starts to move them, is because they start to realize that the impact of what they're doing is causing so much harm that ultimately is impacting public safety and security, ultimately is going to cost them more money. And one thing that I haven't mentioned yet is the impact on policing, because when you task police officers with raising revenue, whether that's imposing lots of tickets in order to charge people more fines and fees, or it's arresting someone and bringing them into jail because they owe fines and fees, you're taking those officers away from their principal job, which is deter, detect, and solve crime. There's a survey from Alabama. They surveyed 1,000 people who owed fines and fees. And 38% of those people admitted to committing a crime, principally selling drugs, selling themselves, or shoplifting, stealing, in order to pay their court debt. Now, I'm a former judge. People don't usually admit to committing crime. That I suspect the number's higher than that. We did a similar survey in New Mexico. It was about 40%. We're not making our communities safer by doing this. We are just making them poorer, and we're doing that in the communities that need our help most.
So far, everything we've been talking about just strikes me as almost ludicrous. I mean, it makes no rational sense. But fortunately, there are some good signs on the horizon, right? States are starting to pass laws saying, not just the Supreme Court, we're saying it's against the law to assess these fines and fees. And there's also court suits that are having a lot of impact. Could we start in the state legislatures, please? So
sure.
Give us a quick look at what's happening in the states to improve things.
So probably the most successful reform since our organization started, which was in 2018, and we are the only national organization that is focused on fines and fees.
This is the Fines and Fees Justice Center, right?
Correct. But there are lots of people all over the country working together to fight this. Probably the single greatest reform nationwide has been the elimination of driver's license suspensions for unpaid fines and fees. It's not hard for people to understand why that's a counterproductive policy. And when you say it, and we also get employers saying it because they need people with valid driver's licenses. A lot of jobs in the United States require a valid driver's license, but they also need people to get reliably to work. And so we're able to put together large coalitions. When we started in 2018, there were only 5 states that did not suspend your license for unpaid fines and fees. And today there are over 25 that have changed their laws so that they no longer do that. So that's a huge reform.
And this is because of your lobbying and your agitating.
And that's because of the work of our organization, but also lots of community groups, lots of partners in those states have worked hard to have that happen. The second biggest success nationwide, and it's something we haven't mentioned yet, is ending fines and fees in juvenile courts. Because believe it or not, all across the country, these same fines and fees were being imposed on young people and their families if a child was in the juvenile justice system. And if you think adults have a hard time paying fines and fees, imagine you're a child. In Florida, even today, if you're 14 years old and you get in trouble, right, graffiti or you shoplift, fines and fees are imposed. If you don't pay them by the time you're 16, you don't get a driver's license.
Wow.
And if you're 18, you owe them to the state. So you start life as an adult in debt. There was a large national campaign of which we were a part called Debt-Free Justice that has been very successful in eliminating juvenile fines and fees all over the country. In New Mexico, in 2023, the legislature eliminated all of them, and the governor signed the bill. That effort was led by a lot of people who were impacted in New Mexico, but it was also championed by the then Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court.
So there is progress in the states, but still we want to stress to people that many communities still conduct this practice of assessing fines and fees and putting people in jail. So it's not gone away.
There are still fees, even in the places where we've made substantial reform.
But the other thing that's happening, I take it, is that groups that you work with are suing communities across the country, and they've had some success. I talked, for example, with a lawyer at the Southern Poverty Law Center, Micah West, who has sued communities for this issue we talked about earlier, where they arrest people because they fell behind paying their garbage collection fees. People went to jail. And now in some communities, courts have stopped that practice.
That's right. And what is an even better approach because it involves money. Missouri is a good example. There's a group called Arch City Defenders who are in St. Louis, and they have sued lots of the small towns in St. Louis County, and they've won money judgments and forced the cities to pay people for what they did to their lives, their unconstitutional practices.
Uh-huh.
What's the scale of the awards where people have won?
In Ferguson itself, I think the settlement was about $3.5 million. That may not sound like a huge amount, but in a city the size of Ferguson, that's a lot.
And I guess the judges don't have to pay. It's the taxpayers who actually end up paying, right? But at least there's that possible deterrent for local governments and courts to, think again about doing this. I would imagine, right?
And let me just say on the legislative side, this is a surprisingly to a lot of people, bipartisan issue. This is one of the few areas in public policy where there is remarkable agreement on the left, the right, and the center.
Hallelujah.
I'll give you a great example. Governor Stitt of Oklahoma, who is conservative. He is one of our strongest allies. He wants to eliminate all fees in the Oklahoma system.
Ah, interesting.
In his State of the Union, he talks about ending fees in Oklahoma.
To have safe communities, we also have to have some common sense. Let me tell you a story about a man named John Stanfield. He reportedly owes nearly $30,000 in fines, fees, and court costs. That's simply unacceptable. It's time to reform this system and get rid of what is essentially a debtor's prison.
Well, so we've just been talking about encouraging signs across the country, and I don't want to be a total downer now, but you gave a speech almost 10 years ago to a bar association conference. You said after working with the justice system, you've come away with two really powerful feelings about it, one uplifting and one really depressing.
So the justice system is the place where our rights and responsibilities are enforced. It's where we turn to when our rights have been violated, and it can be a place of redemption. But what I've also learned is that the system can be a place of oppression. And that's when we base our decisions on money. It is where that happens at its worst, because we cannot make the measure of justice the measure of someone's wealth. That is fundamentally un-American, and it is unjust. But our system does it every day.
Lisa Foster co-founded the National Fines and Fees Justice Center, and now she's senior advisor.
Thank you both for shining a light on this issue. It's important.
I hope progress continues to make things better.
We do too.
And that's it for this episode of Two Reporters.
You'll find us on Apple, Spotify, or pretty much any leading podcast site. And we hope you'll check out more of our work at tworeporters.org. I'm David Schipler.
And I'm Daniel Zwerdling. Please join us again soon for another episode of Two Reporters. Bye-bye.